We're going to talk about Hal.
We're going to talk about Hal, yes. So Richard Halliwell. Um, uh, I guess, I mean, we were talking about doing a video about Space Hulk, particularly, trying to track down Dean Bass, who did a lot of work on Space Hulk, and to talk about that. And kind of like spiraling out of that, it just seemed like a good idea to talk about Richard Halliwell, who's arguably, one of the greatest miniature war games designers ever, really, I would say.
Yes, and very influential.
Yeah. And who we both worked with and knew well, and he was like a good friend for both of us, really.
Well,
I mean, especially you, Rick, of course, because you grew up together.
Well, we grew up together, so we were very good friends in our early teens, and then later on we worked together both on projects for tabletop games and then with Games Workshop. And Hal started working at Games Workshop Citadel, really. I think when I was still at college, I think he got he was working doing mold making.
Yeah. Well, you'd done Reaper together, hadn't you?
Yeah.
And
Combat 3000.
Combat 3000, yeah.
We did those before really before Citadel existed, I think.
Yeah.
The original Reaper we did, I think it was my last year at school or I just left. So we were developing the game during that sort of my last year at school, and it'd be Hal would have had a year out before he went to university. Because he was young, he was fast streamed through the school system, so he left before he was old enough to go to university.
Yeah.
So,
He lived his light under a bushel, but he was very, very clever.
yeah, he did politics at Nottingham, which was not an easy thing to do either.
No.
He wrote his dissertation on Dick Taverne, who was Lincoln's MP. He was a kind of a rebel, independent MP.
Yeah, that sounds like Hal.
I thought so. I always thought, well, that's two rebels together.
Yeah.
And he, at the same time as he was doing his degree, he must have been working on Combat 3000, 3001, writing articles for Brian Ansell's Troll Crusher magazine.
Yeah.
Getting to know those guys. And the great thing about Hal, from their point of view, was Hal could drive.
Right, okay.
Brian Ansell couldn't drive in those days, and I don't think the other guys did, so they needed someone to drive them around the shows.
And it was Hal.
Yeah, and Hal drove them around the shows.
Thought, really,
so on one occasion, I think he took them to Reading, and then on the way back, they tried to pay him in castings. He was a bit pissed off about that. It's like, no! No, we did a lot of that. Because I was in Lincoln and he was in Nottingham, he was always toing and froing, and his parents were still in Lincoln. So at that time there was quite a bit of toing and froing, and he'd drop in, and we'd talk about stuff and projects we were working on and things we were doing together. So.
Yeah, well, I remember Reaper quite well because I bought it and stuff. I had a copy, and it was a clever game. I thought I can remember statting up things because you could. It was system agnostic, so you could take any models you like and work out profiles for them. And I can remember doing that, working through my collection and kind of like doing stuff and working out the percentages. Yeah. Lots of percentage dice kind of like stuff going on there.
There were two editions of it as well. The first edition was the one that Hal and I put together. The Nottingham Model Soldier Shop sold, published and sold. Yeah. And Brian organised that.
Yeah.
So we went to Brian Ansell. So that's how we met him, actually, because we'd got this game Reaper, and we wanted to publish it, and we wondered if Asgard would publish it. Asgard had just started up.
Yeah.
And because they were local, we phoned them up. I think literally Hal phoned them up. Because he's a very brave character, Hal. He's quite fearless.
That's true. Yeah, he was. Definitely was.
I don't think I'd have had
all his travels and stuff like that that he did later on.
I don't think I would have had the nerve, but Hal did. So really, he started that whole relationship off, and we went over because Hal could drive. We went over to see Brian and demoed the game, and it came up from there. The relationship developed, and then we worked together on various things.
Yes. And that's what led to working together on Warhammer then, basically, for Citadel.
Yeah, I think by that time I was doing Hal had actually done the mail order at Citadel before me.
Yeah.
Because when I was at college in Lancaster, Hal would send me things from the mostly from the rejects bin or the sweepings of the floor. Bits of pork pie on occasions, and a pair of socks. No, I like one sock. He would do that just as a gag because he was running the mail order department, or he was the mail order department, so he could just put parcel things up
and send them to you.
It was always fun.
Yeah.
And later on, he learned how to make molds. Brian taught him how to make molds.
Yeah, he was a very good mold cutter, as I understand.
I think so, although he did famously on one occasion drop a scalpel into his leg. Do you remember?
Yes, I do vaguely remember that. But I also kind of have a vague memory about, was it the big dragon that Tony Ackland made that he had to cut the mould for, which was incredibly difficult? That was the Perrys, right? Okay.
Yeah, the chicken dragon.
Yeah.
As it's charmingly known sometimes. Hal made the original set of moulds for that, which were all double depth.
Yeah.
So he had to laminate 2 sets of moulds together.
Yeah.
Which was really quite tricky. But he then also cast it.
Yeah.
And they couldn't, at the time, Brian didn't want the regular casters to cast it because they were all paid by metal weight. They'd have been walking out millionaires, like having cast the chicken dragon. Yeah. So Hal did it on a contract basis, piecework.
Yeah.
And he basically did it overnight. Huh. All the guys had gone home, so he was on his own, and he just, I think he took various substances to keep himself
that he probably
alert.
Did. Yes, yeah.
And just cast like stink through the night.
Yeah. Oh dear.
But that was typical of Hal.
Yeah, it's very typical of Hal. But I think the interesting thing about the mould cutting is that it's. I think he had quite a good way of the way that he visualised things. Yeah, he could, and you can see it to an extent in some of the games and stuff he designed. And then what he did later on when he became a computer games designer, I think he was quite good at visualising in 3 dimensions almost.
Oh, okay.
Because I think that's partly what you need to do with the mould cutting stuff, isn't it? To be able to understand how the air is going to kind of exit the mould and things like that. And,
that's right. Well, Brian would have taught him the basics of mould making.
Yeah.
And Brian was an excellent mould maker. I mean, never surpassed.
Yeah.
And I think all the people that were taught by Brian have gone on to be very competent.
Yeah.
I mean, Alan Merritt was a very good mould maker as well. He was taught by Brian. And I think Anthony Epworth, our friend Ep, he was also taught the fundamentals by Brian, and he's gone on to run his own mould making business.
Yeah, absolutely.
He makes all the Perry's moulds, for example.
Yeah. No, he's a great mould cutter. But it's one of those interesting things. Mould cutting is very rarely talked about, but particularly for metal miniatures.
Yeah.
It was. I don't know. It's a bit like with comics. You get the artists and you get the inker, and the two together create the artwork that you see in the comic, and then colorists now as well. And it's a little bit like that kind of relationship, I think, between the miniature designer and the mould cutter and stuff like that. A good mould cutter can allow you to do something, to create a model that you wouldn't be able to make otherwise. Because it just wouldn't be castable.
I mean, the format of a mould does dictate what you can do in terms of the toy soldiers to some extent. To a large extent, but if you look at some of the castings from Griffin moulds, who I think don't operate anymore, the guy that did it stopped, he retired, I think, but they could cast almost anything. But what they would do was they would charge you on the basis of the castings. So if it took them 4 or 5 goes to get a casting, you paid relatively more for it.
Right, okay.
And that was the trick. Brian Ansell was always much more interested in mould yield.
Yeah.
So you cut a mould so that every time you cast it, you get 100% spin rate, ideally. And that really involves designing the models to fit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Hal would have understood all that. He would have made molds.
Yeah.
For the models that Perry's made, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
And Perry's are swines, to this day. Getting stuff to mould it was always a little bit tricky. Yeah. Good fun. So he did a bit of that. I remember him. He had a flat on Forest Road, and I remember him coming in having done a mould, a day's mould cutting. I think it was for tabletop games at the time.
Right.
But if you're making master moulds in particular at that time, you're using black rubber and graphite, and he'd come in and he'd be covered in graphite. And he'd have a bath, and the bath would be black. You know? But I don't think they do that these days. I think it's all mostly silicon molds, and they've even given up using talc. We used to talc all the molds with French chalk.
No, they're all sort of pink now, the molds, basically.
Yeah, and they use cornstarch to talc on them because they're all frightened of asbestos contamination.
Yeah.
But we weren't.
It was a simpler time.
Simpler days, yes.
But yeah, so then you moved on from like running mail order and cutting molds to designing Warhammer, basically.
Well, he moved on to being itinerant, because when he did Warhammer, he wasn't working for Citadel.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, because he got paid a royalty, didn't he?
Yeah, he got paid, well, as he died, in fact, but it was commissioned as an out-of-house project.
Yeah.
How was one of these people, well, as you remember, he didn't take to regular employment easily, did he?
No, he didn't. No. He was a free spirit and a proper anarchist, I think, in his way.
Yeah.
He was. So he was. Travelling was important to him. Around the world and stuff on his motorbike and stuff, and all kinds of things that he did.
He went around. He went around Europe. I remember when we were doing our late teens, when he with his with an early girlfriend called Marion, after whom Marienburg is named.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. And he later went around Africa.
Yeah.
Went through Sudan, Egypt, Sudan. He flew to Greece, where apparently he reckoned that he ended up, I think, losing his luggage, as was typical Hal. There's always one disaster after another.
It really was, yeah. Bad. It was some bad disasters at some point.
Yeah. Went to Egypt, where he got all his traveller's checks stolen. Because I remember arranging a phone call. Because in those days you couldn't just phone up.
No, it was really hard. And getting money to people was hard in those days as well.
Was. I think he got some money wiped in by his dad in the end. Yeah. And then down into the Sudan.
Yeah.
He
did some amazing travels. I mean, all the way through his life, really. Until he got
right until
poorly
the
at the
end.
Yeah.
And his last travels were in Asia, and I think he got based in India, wasn't he?
Yeah, and ended up getting arrested or something like
that.
Well,
he claims so.
It's hard to tell at the end. He did these amazing things, and so he was travelling and very much a free spirit, basically.
Yeah, but that's why. It's often hard to tell, exactly who did what, because Hal would he'd get back into Britain. He'd go, "I'm skint. What can I do? I'll phone up my mate Brian." Mm-hmm. Phones up Brian. "You got any work for me?" "Oh, well, you could come in and make some molds."
Yeah.
But he'd do it on a freelance basis.
Yeah.
Or you could perhaps do some. He wouldn't tend to do packing, Hal, but you could come in and do something, and because Brian knew Hal from his days as doing Troll Crusher magazine and contributing articles to D&D and bits and bobs, and Reaper and Combat 3000, Brian knew that Hal could write wargames rules. Because actually we tended to write them together, and the truth was Hal tended to be the designer, and I tended to be the lead designer. I tended to be the tidier upper and producer.
Hal never found it really hard to finish things.
Yeah, he wasn't a complete
the truth
finisher.
of the matter. He was not a complete finisher.
Whereas that's what I am really. I'm a very good complete finisher. Whereas often I need to take an idea. Somebody else will come up with an idea, or I'll see an idea or something. I go, "Oh, that's useful. I can use that." Whereas Hal would come up with ideas.
Yeah, Hal would, and that was his real genius.
Yeah. So we worked together as a team, a very good team, I think. And
we're one of the first great wargames teams, I'd say. Really,
it's the Lennon and McCartney of wargaming, I tell you.
Well, I think it really and truly is. Actually, I think that before then, wargames rules were written by one person, so you didn't get Charles Grant and Donald Featherstone writing a set of wargames rules. It just didn't happen. Really.
Phil Barker and Bob O'Brien.
I suppose you could see it like that.
Yeah,
that's true. Wargames Research Group.
They were a bit of a team.
It was really Phil Barker.
It became that. Yeah. But I think Warhammer became me in a similar way.
Yeah, I guess it did in the longer run after. Because Hal was only around for the first 2 editions, I'd say.
I don't think he was even there for the second. He might have done I think he did the scenario for it.
Yeah.
But it was,
I think it really was the first edition.
Yeah.
Yeah, he might have done a scenario or two.
a third, he must have been around, but I don't know if he. It's funny. You see, I find it very hard to remember quite when Hal was employed by us and when he wasn't. I don't think he was properly employed until the 80s.
Yeah, no, well, he was employed when I got to know him, because that's
Yeah.
when I moved up to Nottingham in the early 80s. So 83, 84, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd have been
It's sort of-
actually working
Yeah.
for the company, I think.
But even then, you know, he could take off at any minute.
Yeah. No, he was difficult to pin down. But I think that that bit about the thing that always impressed me about Hal was that if you've got a game, you want to achieve something with the game. You've got an idea of how you're going to, what you'd like the game to be about.
Yeah.
And so you'll then say, okay, well, I want the game to be about 2 soldiers hitting each other with swords, basically. And you'll say, okay, well, and then you ransack your brain of mechanics and things like that, and do things, and you kind of you work your way along. And you say, well, I could say that they have to roll to see if they hit each other, and then if their armor works and stuff like that. But Hal would very often instead of coming at it head on, would sort of almost come at sideways. He was very lateral thinking of thing. And it would often lead to him creating mechanics and ideas that were really quite clever and unique. And he just was the best at that of anybody I really met, I think, just delivering, something quite unexpected.
Yes.
Based on whatever he was briefed to do or was going to achieve.
He's very focused on the gameplay as well. One of the things I always remember Hal saying to me, because I tend to do stuff that's a little bit more role play, a little bit more narrative.
The question of mine was did he buy into the kind of role play element?
No, he was very adaptable.
Sure.
But when he was designing a game, he had a very strong focus on how do you win this game? What's the route by which you achieve victory or success? Which is would stand me in very good stead in terms of computer games design, because they tend to be very like that. Yeah. But it's the case with Space Hulk, and it's how do you win, not how do you push those soldiers around and have a good time.
Yeah.
It's the focus on the mental challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not he wasn't as interested in having a good time, but he didn't see it as a narrative.
Yeah. I think he had got that kind of I think that what you get from a game in terms of, is it an immersive, kind of almost like role-playing experience, is it like a problem, it's something you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
He was more on, he saw games as games, and you definitely see that with Space Hulk and some of the other board games and things that he did, but Space Hulk in particular is almost like a series of chess problems that you're trying to figure out the best way to solve. And again, I think that served him well when he was doing computer game levels and stuff like that. He was very good at creating little things, but then he'd raid all kinds of places for the theme and the ideas.
Yeah. Well, yes, he was very clever. Very well read as well. Hal. We were both really into science fiction and fantasy in our teens, and he absorbed all that stuff.
A bit of a broad question then. Would Space Hulk have been kind of influenced, I suppose, by early sci-fi?
It was influenced by aliens. It's what it was influenced by.
Aliens, but also when we were kids, when we were mid-teens, we used to play boarding actions.
Yes, that's true.
Which we would draw out onto A3 size pieces of paper, and then we would play out the actions using the Minifigs SF range, which came out in about 72, 73, 72, I think.
I think I've still got one or two of them, actually, weirdly.
Yeah, so have I. And and I can remember doing those, and they were very Space Hulk-like. And you go from one end of this A3 sheet of paper down the corridors and these sick bays, reach the other end, and then you turn over. We did it it was a big book, actually, like a scrapbook. It turned over to page 13 or whatever, and then you'd be in the engine room. And you'd do that.
So there was some traveller supplements that worked like that as well, because I remember being very impressed with, there was a Zanti highlight.
Yes, I remember that.
Where you got this gigantic floor plans for a gigantic spaceship, which had like 16 floors or something. It was nuts, basically. And then you'd play boarding action games on it, more or less, is what it was.
So I think there was a bit of a trope
there was a
there.
tradition. I think you're right. But then, and I guess that's the kind of like saying that, like how kind of like emerged together, because I know that there was the desire, because we'd got the Gene Stealers, stuff like that, were very alien-like, and inspired by those movies. But then kind of mixing it together with those boarding action games, so you've got this, like just the best boarding action game, really. It was,
It really established what the Gene Stealers were, because if you look at the original Rogue Trader book, the Gene Stealer there looks nothing like a Gene Stealer.
No, absolutely nothing like it at all.
It's like a leech with 4 arms.
Yeah.
And the version that was adapted for or recreated for Space Hulk, I think was the first time that was done.
Yeah.
And that very much was aliens. Somebody obviously decided,
I've got a feeling it was Brian. I've
It
got
would
a
be,
feeling, yeah. No, he wanted that was probably the brief.
Yeah.
As much as anything. Though, without having Hal here to be able to ask him what the brief was, that's a difficult one.
It would have been. It would have been Brian pushing on that, and the Terminators as well.
Yeah.
That would have been Brian, because he had that thing going on with Laserburn and the Laserburn universe, where he had what he called Dreadnought armor.
Yeah.
So it's the bigger version of the bigger version. That was definitely a Brian thing.
Well, I think that Dreadnought armor was very much kind of like Starship Troopers novel kind of, rather than movie kind of.
It's not in the original Rogue Trader. There's no Space Marine Terminators.
No. There's lots of little bits and pieces that got added in, because it was an evolving kind of like thing at the time.
Yeah. So that got reincorporated into 40k and the 40k universe. So to some extent, that Space Hulk did direct what was going on at the time.
Yeah, no, I think so. It was influential, wasn't it? Definitely.
I've never played the first edition Space Hulk. Was that Dark Angels?
I don't think it was. I think it was Blood Angels, actually, wasn't it? I think. I can't remember now.
Blood Angels in the first.
Yeah, because you've got Deathwing Supplement, which is where you get a version of the Dark Angels, but actually it got completely rewritten.
Yeah.
Brian was obsessed with being American Indians.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
So
one
they,
of my questions, I suppose,
yeah.
was how do you dictate what kind of Space Marine captains were involved in this game?
yeah,
It was really strange, particularly from my point of view at the time, because I'd kind of like created 40k and had an idea of what these chapters were and what they were doing, and suddenly the Dark Angels, who I'd always imagined to be medieval and monastic and black armor and everything, hence the Dark Angels, were suddenly green American Indians. Okay, right. How bizarre.
Yes. But I mean, that was it was interesting, and then that background got rewritten later on, effectively. So so you got a kind of, but I think the original, I'm pretty sure that the original one was Blood Angels,
It was a red cover. It's a red.
it was. Yeah, no, it was Blood Angels. It was Blood Angels, and you got that. Yeah, so there wasn't much background in that in the first one, but the bits that were in there were written by Hal, as I remember, and were really kind of like neat, because he was a great. Like we were saying earlier, basically, when he put his mind to it, he could write.
Yes,
he really could,
cool.
And I still really like the background in the very first edition book. It's just a great little bit of writing, very terse, and evocative.
Yeah,
I think
he always hated anything that was purple. I mean, overwritten and elaborate.
I see what you mean. Never liked the Gene Stealers.
Not that colour. No, he hated purple prose, and would always take the piss out of me, because I'd often write quite in a sort of, I'd adopt a Miltonic sort of phrase and and put lots of adjectives. And Al said, no adjectives, no exclamation marks.
Yeah.
Which is why, and he used to take the piss out of me because I'd put too many exclamation marks, which I did. Mm-hmm. And whenever I used to credit Hal or put his name in, I always used to substitute one of the L's for an exclamation mark. take the piss out of me. Yeah, good lad. Yeah. But no, he's certainly one of the most original, I think, designers of I've ever met, who we ever worked with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I think that another really good example of that was Blockmania, which there's is there a new edition out or something like that? There's I think there might be just recently, but so it was 2000 AD licensed game, and about block wars, which is something that happened in the comic. And again, what Hal did was normally, if you were doing a war game, which is meant to be a heavy size fighting, you do it from the top. You kind of like you have your pieces that you're moving around on a map that represents. So if it was this, it would be looking top down at the battlefield. And so Hal subverted that and turned it all sideways. So the map was a tower block from the side with the floors going up as you went up.
Yeah, which meant visually it looked like a tower block.
It looked like a tower block, and then the way that you won was that you had to blow up the squares, and if you could get all the way from one side to the other on the opposing tower block, it fell down. And it was such a great idea, I thought. It really was, and again, very visual and clever.
I think kind of, in some sense.
Yeah, I think that, Space Hulk will always be Hal's masterpiece, basically. It stands up to this day, I'd say, as an absolutely great game. But Blockmania, for me, kind of like epitomised his way of thinking almost in a way. It was so Hal, that game, it really was.
And the text, actually some of the stories and texts he did for the 2000 AD license, but in particular for that Judge Dredd megacity environment, was hilarious.
Yeah, they did some great stuff. He did the Rogue Trooper game. I was going to say Rogue Trader, the Rogue Trooper game as well, which is a nice spin on Talisman, basically. It was like Talisman done right, almost, in many ways.
Yeah, that is very successful, really. All the things he did for that license were good.
Yeah.
I think it's because he must have had a good brief on those, and because you're working within the...
Yeah. He must have read the comics when he was growing up.
Oh, God, yeah.
So he was steeped in it.
Yeah. 2000 AD and Star-Lord, we both read from almost like issue 1.
Yeah, me too. It was one of the, if you get your early, like 2000 ADs, like first 200 issues or so, and read through them, you'll see a lot of Games Workshop stuff.
Absolutely.
Very, very inspirational.
Remember, I did the original Judge Dredd role-playing game.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd sat there with 200, it was almost literally the first 200 progs, as they called them, and read them all through. I think the first few I only had photocopies of the Judge Dredd sections, which I got from Ian Livingston. Yeah. But all the rest, I borrowed Hal's. We had stacks of the thing. Yeah, and you can see it in Games Workshop's games. You can even see it in Space Hulk to some extent. There's it's in there, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that, you talk about legacies and taking things back to Hal. Hal's legacy on the war games industry is huge, basically. The core game mechanics of Warhammer were much down to him as anything else. So that,
he did.
To hit, to wound, to saving throws and stuff like that. Because as I remember, I think you were telling me about it, Brian had said it had to work with D6s.
Yeah.
And that's a problem when you've got a goblin and a dragon.
Yeah.
It's like how do I get it so that you can represent a goblin and a dragon using only 6-sided dice? And so what he did was split it up. So the 3 rolls there are there to give you a mathematical range. Yeah. Basically.
It's actually almost an adaptation because it was a commission. I think Hal didn't. He saw it as being and bearing in mind we had no idea this was going to go on and become a phenomenon. It was just, we were writing as a war game in the same ways in which he'd done Imperial Commander for tabletop games. So it was a kind of, here's a brief, here's a bit of work, here's the money you're going to get for it. Knock out, go to the pub, come back. Knock out, go to the pub, come back. So you weren't going to spend years perfecting this. It wasn't going to be a piece of art. It was going to be a work for hire. And so what Hal did was he basically took our Reaper system, which was percentage based, but it had the idea of you make a roll to hit and then you make a roll to kill based on, it's to hit, to wound. And as Jervis says, there wasn't enough room on a D6 to do that, so it just extended the final roll into 2 rolls, created dice walls in effect. And it just worked brilliantly, didn't it?
It stands up. Yeah, it really does. I mean, some people can see it as being clunky, but I think that it's so obvious and there's something so satisfying. But within those mechanics, which is why it's still around and why it's still being used and why it's still popular.
It's not clunky in practice. I mean, that's the interesting thing. It's one of those things that looks clunky on paper. But in reality it isn't, because you just kind of go dice roll, pick, re-roll. And because you pass dice from one player to the other as well, so it has a sense in which each player is taking part in the action, which I think is an incidental factor of the mechanic. But it works it just gives it the right feel.
But I think I think it is incidental, but I think it's also kind of like spotting that that's a satisfying thing.
Absolutely.
And sticking with it, because I can remember. So when Warhammer came out, I was working for Games Workshop down in London, and so the Warhammer box turned up for the first time, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, oh gosh, well, yeah, that seems a bit clunky. Wouldn't you just kind of like merge these things together and kind of like do it all on one roll? And I can remember sitting down writing something, and I just completely missed the point, basically. So I think that it's quite easy as a games designer to try and come up with a sophisticated, clever idea for something, when in actual fact, really what you want is something that does the job and is satisfying in play. And I think another example of me kind of missing the point completely, and something we were talking about earlier, was that in Space Hulk, the timer is such an important aspect of capturing the feel of what the brief was about. So the brief was aliens, and that tension, particularly for the humans that are up against the aliens, and the timer it captured that brilliantly. It just made it tense when you're the Space Marine player. You're just kind of like thinking, oh my God, I'm so desperate, and you start sweating. But it was an issue because we couldn't afford to put a timer in, so it ended up kind of like saying, we'll just use, we'll tell people to choose their watch, because everybody's got a watch. And to be honest, that worked fine. Then when I got to work on the second edition, you see, I thought, we were thinking we were going to have to put a timer in, but it was going to have to be an egg timer. We couldn't tell people to do things, and it was just like there was all kinds of like nonsense associated, but it simply wasn't going to work. So I thought, well, I know from experience that after you've played Space Hulk a few times, you do your turn as a Space Marine player easily within 2 minutes. It doesn't become an issue anymore. So I thought, well, you can probably lose it. And I regret that to this day, because it meant that the second edition was it lost that really important bit. And it's such a tiny little thing. And it doesn't technically really make terribly much difference to the way the game plays. Which I knew from experience. But what it does is it creates an atmosphere the first time you play it. That stays with you every other time that you play it. It's the memorable thing.
That's a very good point.
And then I think in the third edition we were actually able to get the egg timers in. So the final deluxe edition, where I realised the error of my ways, and very much I wanted it to be a homage to HAL as much as anything, and got the chance to do this kind of like very deluxe edition with. We were able to emboss and deboss the boards, so you got texture that was up and down. It was like super kind of like fun, and had the timer in, and I could rectify my own error, basically. But there's little things like that make a big difference.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, and I'm very disappointed in you, Jervis.
I hang my head in shame. I do. But yeah, I mean, like, you live and learn. You've got to make mistakes along the way, and
And we made plenty of those.
Well, definitely. Yeah. Well, HAL too, for that matter. Not necessarily in games design, but it's sort of like, he was a free spirit and anarchic. And left, really early on in Workshop's history, from our point of view.
When would HAL have left?
It must have been mid-80s.
Yeah, it was a little bit anarchic. What happened was his late 80s, I think. In the late 80s, Brian started to step away a bit from the business. I think he was already preparing it for resale. Because he bought the business off Steve and Ian. And then we was running the business, but he was running it on low investment, maximise profit. And he was trying to get it ready for sale for the next stage of business, which would have been somebody who would want to grow the business. Because Brian never wanted to grow it beyond about mid-teens turnover, millions. So maybe 13, 14 million turnover, which at the time was quite a lot of money. Because that enabled him to take about £1 million profit out of it every year. If he wanted to then make it bigger, you have to invest that money back into the business. Well, I don't think Brian was up for that. He wanted to sell it on. Trouser the money and parachute out, which he did eventually to Tom Kirby. But it meant he wasn't around a great deal. He was he might have even been preparing himself to become a tax exile, which is what, of course, everyone does when they do these things. And I think the studio was getting really sloppy. We weren't getting work done. Nothing was coming out. Realm of Chaos was stalled.
Oh God, right? Yes,
Lost in the Down. Well,
they took ages to get written. Those books.
Yeah, well,
They
it's
really
because
did,
nobody knew what. And Brian wasn't about to tell people what he wanted. He was only on the phone. No internet. No nothing clever like that. You know.
Those big long memos, of course, from Brian.
Huge memos from Brian, which were indecipherable and usually contradicted the last memo that he sent you.
Yeah.
You know, really quite difficult to work with. Poor old Nigel Stillman, I remember, being broken man after one of Brian's memos. But in any case, I think what had happened had been Hal had been working on at least 2 projects, as I can remember, that just went nowhere. There was the epic scale Warhammer.
Right, okay.
Oh yeah, that was,
Which I can only vaguely remember.
Yeah, no, me too, actually.
But I remember it using different coloured dice with different numbers on to represent hits and defences, you know. Yeah. And obviously the spaceship game, the first version of Battlefleet Gothic,
Right.
which we'd almost like advertised. And I think various people had done artwork for. And
the very first Rogue Trader advert says there's going to be a spaceship battle.
Yeah.
I remember it. It was like so before 40K came out.
It was a spaceship.
advertising
Well, the original version of the game that I wrote before I joined Games Workshop was a spaceship game. Hence it's called Rogue Trader. It was kind of like about being a rogue trader amongst the stars, and like a pirate and a brigand. But Hal had started work on the first Battlefleet Gothic, and in fact we even made the plastic models to go in the box, which ended up in Space Fleet. So it was going to be quite a big project, and I remember there was a real enthusiasm for it in the community, because I remember Richard Halliwell, who was at the time, he was, I think, running America.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying to me, basically, we could sell 2 turds in a box if it had the word "Get Battlefleet Gothic" on it. I thought, yeah, okay, don't take us up on that one. But it never got produced. I think Hal just got lost in the game's design.
Yeah, I think so. I think also there was that bit where they were being bought out of the royalty things as well. That definitely didn't make him happy, because for Hal, and I guess you, and for me with Blood Bowl, we got paid royalties, and then it got to this stage where Brian, I think it was Brian, it was decided that we'd be bought out of the royalties, basically, because it just didn't make good business sense for us to have them. So we got paid a big lump sum. And I don't think Hal thought it was a big enough lump sum, really.
Perhaps not.
He didn't have much choice.
No, absolutely. Well, I didn't either. And bear in mind, I had a royalty on 40K.
Yeah.
So it was the original, when 40K came out, I think what happened was it basically doubled my salary that year.
Yeah.
And my salary wasn't all that huge. None of us
were.
were.
For me as well, actually. That wasn't on the same scale. So, and it made it, because it was, they were reasonable royalties. They
well, it's 2%.
Yeah. Ex-VAT retail.
Yeah.
There was the retail price as well. So it was like, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely, it definitely added up. But I can remember he wasn't happy about that, and I think that probably soured things a bit.
Yeah.
So he decided to move on and travelled,
Yeah.
and ended up working in the computer games industry, basically.
He worked in America.
Yeah, he lived in San Francisco for quite a while.
When he totaled at least one car in one of his many trips. Yeah. And rode motorbike down the Pan American Highway. Yeah.
And then travelled around.
Then got stolen.
And things. Ended up kind of like coming back to the UK in the end, and then got very poorly towards the end, and just wasn't. Yeah, but he was still games designer. I remember more or less the last time I saw him. Really, he'd got this bee in his bonnet about doing a World War II little skirmishy game.
Yeah, it's because that was what we did when we were kids.
That's right.
He was going back to that.
He was, but he got all of these notes. It was absolutely classic. So he got some mechanics and rules and things like that, and he'd got these scenarios for it, and it was all like kind of British Home Guard in World War II fighting against German parachutists in Ambridge. From the Archers, basically. So all the scenarios were set around Ambridge. It was hilarious. It really was. And that was so Hal. It was going. It was like because it wasn't as subtle, basically. But if you know your Archers stuff, it would be like you could spot all the little references.
We could just imagine,
couldn't you? For that matter as well.
Yeah.
And that so it was so right until the very end.
He's a big Radio 4 fan, Hal. You see.
Absolutely.
We kind of I think in the 70s, Radio 4, if you're a working class lad, Radio 4 had this sort of sense of it being that's what it's from the East Midlands as well. When it's like that's the contact with the wider universe, and things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a lot of Radio 4 comedy. I'm sorry, I read that again, and things like that. It was all Radio 4, and that was Hal's sense of humour was that it was a radio sense of humour based on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But I was able to get him a copy of the 3rd edition Space Hulk as well, and managed to get it designed by Richard Halliwell in the rule book and stuff like that for that game, because it was well that wasn't just me. I mean it was like both of us really, wasn't it?
I tried to do that. I think when we did the 4th edition of Warhammer, he didn't get a credit, but largely because he didn't work on it. But I remember him saying to me he was a bit pissed off about that. I thought, okay, you've got a right to be pissed off, I think. And then from then on, I tried to make sure he was in.
It was hard, and it's always, because I think that like workshop, it's not like Marvel Comics where you kind of like get your or DC Comics for that matter, where the original kind of like designers and artists are kind of like revered and kind of referenced. But I was able to do that and get a copy to him. So which he kept and was obviously very pleased with.
It's a shame, really, because Hal
it's his place in the museum and stuff like that. It's just what you worry is that it gets forgotten.
Yeah, that's
part
right.
of the reason for doing this basically.
Well, I think he left when we moved to the Castle Boulevard studio, because a lot of people left at that time. It was a bit of a...
He definitely never worked there.
No, he didn't. He didn't. And it's because what happened was that was part of the preparing to sell the company.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian was preparing to sell the company. We couldn't actually take people round the original studio because it was such a pit. If you remember.
Yeah.
And it was, so they basically bought the new studio, or took a lease out on the new studio, the Castle Boulevard studio, which was newly refurbished, beautiful area, beautiful space, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And more importantly, from Brian's point of view, we got a year's free rent. So by the time he sold, he would never have to pay rent on it.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So we got a year's free, it's a grace. So we moved into it. It was beautiful. It was also astonishingly hot in the summer.
Yeah, that's right. No air conditioning.
No air conditioning, which was because we didn't realise when we took it out.
Well, we had about sort of
glass ceiling.
Glass ceiling,
glass ceiling. So but
which you couldn't open.
There it was.
And it was so hot. In the end, I had to come in at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever, open all the doors, and there was an air conditioning unit we rented.
Yeah.
and we had to get that going. And it was
No,
ghastly.
it was trouble. But I don't think Hal ever
He
worked there.
never
But he
worked
had his
there.
own little office at Low Pavement, I can remember. And
Yeah, he did. He had to have his own office.
yeah, you couldn't put Hal in with anybody else.
Yeah,
It would have been.
it corrupted them.
It corrupted them, and yes, and smoked them out. 'Cause you were allowed to smoke in the offices then, and Hal would smoke. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And we lost a lot. A lot of the staff didn't make the transition, and it's because what Brian essentially did was go, right, we'll cut the costs on this operation, and it became a desktop publishing business model, whereas previously it had been a complete old-fashioned studio with lots of staff doing production work, and photo typesetter and all that sort of stuff, and we changed that to a desktop publishing model. So we still did paste up, but it was off a high quality printer.
Sure.
We needed fewer production people and, generally speaking, fewer staff. So we almost like halved the staff.
Yeah.
And Hal went along with that. And I think it was partly because he couldn't be managed.
Oh gosh, yes, he was completely.
It was impossible to manage. Yeah. So and Brian had a relationship with Hal, but Brian wasn't there. He was in the Caribbean, I think, by then. So it was all quite. It was a bit unfortunate, but Hal slipped from the company at that point, and that was.
And went on to do other things. He was very successful in his way until he got ill at the end, basically.
Well, he used a lot of his redundancy money from Games Workshop to invest in a design for a computer game that he wanted to produce himself.
Yeah, that's right. That never came through, did it?
Because he's such a shit completed finisher, he never got done. But I think it was a really clever game. It was based on a sort of futuristic tank warfare.
Yes,
I remember it. Yes, World of Tanks in theory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. A bit like Advance Wars as well in its way. Yeah.
But he spent a lot of money on because Hal could program, but he wasn't a programmer. Yeah. But he spent a lot of his money on having this game programmed, and it never went anywhere. Which I think and he wasn't really an entrepreneur. He was a creative spirit at heart. So I think he ended up then having to just take a job.
Yeah. But great games designer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And missed. Yeah, he should be on the sofa with us.
Yeah. Missed, and I missed for a long time as well. It's going back.